All right. So, first up today for our speakers, we have Dr. Julia O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien has held the Paul H. and Grace L. Stern Chair of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible at Lancaster Theological Seminary since 1997. From 1989 to 1997, she served on the faculty of Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. O'Brien received a Bachelor in Religion from Wake Forest University in 1981, an MDiv from Duke Divinity School in 1984, and a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic Studies from Duke University in 1988, where her areas of study included the history and archaeology of Old Testament, as well as Judaism and literary criticism. Her academic specialties include the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, the intersection of gender studies and biblical studies, theological, feminist, and ideological approaches to prophetic books, ethical issues in biblical interpretation, the theology of the Hebrew Bible, violence, and metaphor. Her publications include Micah, Nahum through Malachi, and Challenging Prophetic Metaphor. She edited the Oxford Handbook of the Minor Prophets and the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Bible and Gender Studies. She also has a number of publications in progress. Dr. O'Brien lectures on various topics related to the Bible and contemporary culture, including sexuality and the Bible, the family in ancient and modern perspectives, and reading the Bible in the context of the climate crisis. An avid vegetable gardener, she lives in Lancaster County with her husband, David Mull. And so with that, it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Julia O'Brien. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Katie. And hi, everybody. It's great to see all of these faces. I'm really grateful for this opportunity for the work of Interfaith Power and Light and the opportunity to share a little bit about my own work. Over about, I would say, the last 10 to 15 years that I've been paying lots more attention to climate change, I have actually seen some hopeful trends. And one of these is that Christians from very different theological realms now are increasingly caring about the environment. So you can find official statements and action plans with Protestants and Roman Catholics. You can find them not only among people who call themselves liberals or progressives, but also among people who consider themselves conservative and or evangelical. So, for example, while the progressive denomination with which our seminary is associated, the United Church of Christ, and the nonprofit Evangelical Environmental Network will not agree on abortion, worship styles, and lots of other things, they do agree that Christians are called to climate activism. So you can look at their websites and they support a lot of the same causes. For example, being supporting of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So one might use the language of environmental racism, and another might say pollution hurts the poor. They're not going to be the same, but they all recognize not only that Christians are called to address the environmental issues before us, but also that there is a power differential about how different humans experience the effects of climate change. So they don't agree on everything, but at least they're somewhat on the same page. As I've been watching this kind of greater coming together of Christian groups, one of the themes that I keep hearing is that almost all of these groups, progressive as well as evangelical, are grounding their conviction about Christian call to climate change in the Bible's description of creation. So many Christians across the spectrum will appeal to those early chapters of the book of Genesis, but also other biblical passages to insist that God created the world to be a good place and has given humans the responsibility of, and these are the terms, creation care or stewardship of creation. So if you don't believe me on that, go do an internet search sometime on creation care, creation stewardship. So that focus on the beauty of the world, the awesomeness of nature, and the praise that's due to the God who's the creator of all things has fueled really important work. And I try, whenever possible, to celebrate good work whenever I can. But my own work is suggesting something different. And that is, in this planetary moment, I believe that this exclusive focus on appreciation and praise is too light for the severity of the moment that we're in. So I'm going to overstate the case to get conversation going later. Earth is no longer the beautiful, orderly garden that that Genesis says God created it to be. The climate has already been changed by human hands, and I am arguing that we are long past the mandate to care, maintain, preserve, or appreciate. The alarms have sounded, and it's now time for emergency response to crisis. So, in my work as a biblical scholar and theologian, I've been asking the question of what are other ways that our religious tradition, and particularly the Bible, can resource us for the emergency that stands before us. And because my own research, as you heard, is primarily in the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, I've really focused there. And in this short time that I have, you can probably tell that I'm really excited about talking a lot about it. I'm going to lift up 3 ways that I think that the Bible can provide resources beyond that creation care paradigm. So, number 1, I think these texts can help us recognize when our traditions need to be criticized. If you've done any climate work, you know that many climate theorists are arguing that the roots of the planetary crisis lie in human greed and human self-interest. And while Christianity does seek to limit those human traits, it's also true that our tradition, like other traditions, is not immune from perpetuating those problems. And we need to be able to critique our traditions, including the Bible, right, whenever they do harm. So not all of the Bible treats the earth with care. And in fact, a lot of the same passages that Christians use to kind of lift up the beauty of creation, if you read them in their larger context, they actually serve to promote human interest and often the interest of some humans over other humans. So one example is Psalm 8, which is this beautiful passage, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers. But if you keep reading, what it insists is that God, that creator God, has put all things under humans' feet, right? So it's all bound up together, the praise of God, but also this sense that humans are the ultimate power in the world. As you heard, I also work on the prophetic books of the Bible, and I have lots of examples of how in one moment God's called the creator, and in the next, that argument is used to support a particular agenda where the author's trying to convince you to believe something. So I'm hopeful that by seeing that in biblical text, we can see it in ourselves as well. So number 2, right? The Hebrew Bible offers us powerful words of lament. So already for many places around the globe, the losses due to climate change are already evident. But soon, and very soon, all of us are going to feel those types of grief. losses of homes due to extreme weather, loss of work, family, and the familiar ways that we've done things. And my observation is that many Christian traditions have been so focused on praise and worship that they don't really know how to express pain. And this is where books like Lamentations and Isaiah and Joel can teach us how to express our losses. There's a beautiful passage, and disturbing one too, in Isaiah 24 that talks about how the earth dries up and withers, and the earth lies polluted under its inhabitants. Now, of course, when we use those words, we'll have to be careful to make sure that we keep the blame on ourselves, because some of these talk about that as God's punishment. But we can use these words carefully to help us grieve. And then the third one I'll mention briefly, I hear you, Katie, is that one of the greatest gifts of the Hebrew Bible is its stories, right? Stories about people who have adapted when the world changed. So people who remained immigrants their whole life, like Abraham, or people like Ruth that moved around due to famine and drought. These are stories that can help us think about what it means when there's no going back to normal, when we have to find new patterns of belief and worship. So I found a great comfort in these stories, and particularly in stories of exile, of people who learned to sing new songs in a foreign land. So my time is up. I do care about these issues, and I would love to talk with you more about them either here or, as Katie may share, my email. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. And as I'm sure you can all tell, she contains a wealth of information, and trying to figure out what to share in such a brief time that we have today. As much as we're trying to take a deep dive into each religious tradition, we can only really scratch the surface in an hour of some of the particulars of conversation. So thank you for being on this journey with us. Now I would like to invite Dr. Bradley Johnson, but let me tell you a little bit about him first. So Bradley Johnson is a researcher, writer, and teacher who specializes in global Christianity and the climate crisis. Having worked in government, nonprofits, and education, Bradley earned his PhD in religious studies from Rice University in 2022, where he focused on various Christian responses to the Cape Town, South Africa water crisis between the years of 2015 and 2018. His time is largely spent reading, wandering around Philly, and finding ways to work and think toward a better future. So I'm really excited by some of the global perspective that Dr. Bradley Johnson is going to bring to us today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Julia, for, I think, those really important words about the urgency that we have in this current moment, and the kinds of steps that are needed to both critique and use in the traditions that we have. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of a case study in Cape Town, just to see how a group of Christians, especially the Green Anglicans in Cape Town, dealt with a water crisis between 2015 and 2018. Just give very brief background in case you're not familiar. Cape Town, South Africa, is one of the 3 South African capital cities. Population, metro area is around 4 million people. There's a little racial demographic breakdown. A lot of people associate South Africa with apartheid, understandably so. Technically, it was legally ended in 1994, but it still has massive class and racial inequality because the segregational physical structures of apartheid are still roughly intact. So you still have major racial and class gaps in income and wealth. The water crisis, as it came to be known, was brought about largely by a drought between 2015 and 2018. Climate scientists have predicted that the Cape Town region would be seeing more and more drier situations as time went on, as the climate crisis barreled onwards, and that showed to be true several years ago. The city is very reliant on surface water reservoirs for most of its water consumption, and these largely dried up in the sun over several years, to the point where they had about 17% of the capacity left by the time they reached late 2017, early 2018. And so the city had a policy kept in reserve that they called Day Zero, in which once 13.5% of the reservoir volume was reached, it was threatening to shut down all of the taps in the city, except for those in the central business district and essential buildings like hospitals and government buildings. And they planned 200 water collection points for distribution in case of shutdown, which would have been very chaotic. Thankfully, they never reached Day Zero, but it came very, very close. And part of the reason they averted it was because of rainfall, finally, and because the citizens of Cape Town had to save water in very drastic ways. And so I talked to various churches about how they saved this water, and I came across the Green Anglicans, the Anglican Church in Southern Africa, along the way. You see the person on the right there is Rachel Mash. She is a Scottish immigrant to Cape Town who found the environmental network of the Anglican Church in Southern Africa, and she sort of transformed into the Green Anglicans, and then from there it spread throughout Southern Africa, Portugal, and several other countries. And they're a group of largely Anglican clergy and laity who are trying to figure out how to make the connections between these Christian traditions that we have and how to care for creation and confront the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves. And so I talked to them about what they did. The names that I use here are pseudonyms that I use for the study to protect identities. But I did talk to a priest named Mpumelelo, who talked about a water justice conference that they held in 2018 to address the crisis as it was unfolding. They tried to bring together a bunch of clergy and a bunch of interested lay people around the city, around the country, to talk about how they could better develop eco-theologies that were appropriate for the time. And we also talked to various parishes about the infrastructural adjustments they made in their own churches. For example, they installed tanks to store rainwater for gardens and drinking. A lot of members helped each other install gray water systems in their homes, which is where you use like your used shower water, or to then go to the toilet so that you cut down on water while flushing, or you use it to water your garden. Just finding ways to reuse water throughout the home so that you can use less volume throughout each day. They shared tips, educate each other on how to cut down on overall water wet usage. The clergy even took different members to municipal dams to see just how drastic the situation was. You recall this is a picture of T. Waterskloof, which is the largest reservoir dam in Cape Town, in which about 60% of all the water was stored. This is where it was at the beginning of 2018. And churches also engaged with liturgies, a whole series they called Seasons of Creation, in which they talked about how to engage with different eco-theologies in a way to take a lot of those resources from the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis, but also trying to be critical in a way that would allow them to better take care of the environment in their local situations, and also try to think about how to best address the larger phenomenon they're encountering. Because the water crisis was basically an instance of the climate crisis that really hit them in the face. At the same time, we saw more radical critiques from some of the Green Anglicans that I thought was really worth investigating. So Michael was a parish priest in Christ Church, Constantia, which is famously one of the wealthiest and whitest parts of Cape Town. It's a very big tourist place because that's where a lot of the vineyards and wineries are that date back to the 1600s. And during the Group Areas Act in the 1950s and 60s, because he's colored, which in South Africa basically means multiracial, he and his family were kicked out of Constantia to make room for white families. But today he is the parish priest of the church where his family was kicked away from. And so he told me, I'm just going to read his excerpt because I thought it was an interesting way of narrating his view on the climate crisis. It's a fascinating story, a primal story of our capacity to destroy paradise through our avarice and greed and thinking of our own needs and wants over and above the advice of those who know. God is the one in the story who knows, the story of the Bible. And today we would say that our scientists and people are those who know because they have studied, measured, watched the change, monitored the changes. I think that any kind of efforts on behalf of humanity today is a kind of shutting the stable door after the horse is bolted in any case, because I think the horse is long bolted. A little bit of a pessimistic note there. But that doesn't mean we can't do a thing, but it means we need to think of ways that we can have maximum efficacy in our efforts to try and claw back on some of the irreparable harm and damage that we have done. So he talked explicitly about the consumer habits of white South Africans and the richest parts of the city, particularly those who are in the midst of the crisis, still watering their gardens, still filling their swimming pools, not being best examples for how to live through the climate crisis in a sustainable way. And he brought this to a broader perspective of how we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. The sort of capitalist incentives for endless expansion it conflicts with what we actually have to do to preserve what we have left, even though it's bolted the door, it's bolted from the stable, but trying to fight for what's left and trying to fight for what's needed. Fernando was a Mozambican priest who had lived in Cape Town for a while, and he was a student of the South African struggle against apartheid, which many churches were a part of. Many churches, and especially in the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, famously in Cape Town, they protested and marched and organized against the apartheid government. And he took this as a model for how Christians should address the climate crisis, saying the church actually should continue to play the very role played during apartheid. We're free, but we have another challenge we face today. We have the issues of social inequality, economic freedom, whatsoever. Church is free to act now. It's not free to sit back and watch, but our failure is that we say, we've done it, apartheid's over. Now it's the new South Africa. Now it's time to rest and lead. When climate change is on the horizon for everyone, and the church has to take the exact same kind of stance it did in those times of trying to exercise political, public, organized power in order to fight the climate crisis on every stage in which we're confronted with it. And so that's what I had time for. Very brief view of it. I'm welcome to talk about it some more. And here's my email if you want to reach out a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. So we're going to move now into just a time for some Q&A. So if you have questions for either of our presenters today, you're welcome to put those into the chat and we may try to weave those through. I've also been sitting here taking notes while we've been talking, and so we'll also share some of my own thoughts. And so actually my first question, while we wait to see if folks have questions in the chat too, what has surprised you as a scholar of the Hebrew Bible as you have put it into conversation with these broader social movement conversations, and particularly around climate crisis?
I was really struck by people are finding resources in places that you wouldn't think to find them. So many folks know, if you've been like in a biblical studies class, you may have heard the name of Ellen Davis, who did a book about an agrarian reading of the Bible. And she actually convinced me that the book of Leviticus, which most people just use, in order to bash LGBT people. But the book of Leviticus actually provides some kind of models, because what it does is that it insists that the way you behave, that your practices can transform your thinking. And so I was working with a group of students, and we found that really intriguing, that often it's so hard to change people's mind about climate change, but often you can change people's behavior. So you don't have to change minds before you change behaviors. You can do them both at the same time. And Leviticus has lots of stuff in there, including very clear claims about how the land is treated, and that you restrict yourself, right, for things other than profit. Like, profit does not rule. And so it was a surprising resource to us as we thought about, as we brought that into conversation with some of the more secular climate change work that's really critiquing not only consumerism, but production. I recently read the book by George Rieger, Theology in the Capitalocene, and his argument is that it's very convenient for corporations to let climate change be the responsibility of consumers when the whole system depends on growth and creating markets. So strangely, it was interesting for us to put that into conversation with Leviticus, that said, you don't work on Sabbath. You don't work all the times you can, because wealth is not the ultimate value.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point here around this idea of what it is we value and what we put our worth or investments even into, right? Like, is the chase of further productivity and all of that our focus, or are there other things that we are called to when we think about structuring communities? Dr. Johnson, I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts on this idea behind changing behaviors and changing minds being two separate kind of pieces, and how they interplay together in religious spaces.
Yeah, I do want to say real quick, I'm a big fan of Jörg Rieger. I recommend everyone read him. He's done some great work on sort of the intersection of Christian values and capitalism, and how they often do not cohere very well. But in terms of our behaviors, I think, and religious ideas, I think we have to think about is how we reorient ourselves away from an intensely anthropocentric faith that's, while also trying to, we draw on aspects of Christian traditions that look at how we treat the earth and how we treat others. And I think a good place for people to start with this, if you haven't done already, is reading Laudato Si by Pope Francis. I recommend it to everyone also. Honestly, I think the most radical work that's been put out by a world leader on the climate crisis so far, because he talks about how we have to be fellow travelers with our brethren, with other creatures of the earth. We can't consume endlessly, but we also, as Dr. O'Brien said, we have to address issues of production as well, because part of the reason we have a consumerist issues with mass consumerism is because a lot of these corporations and entities driving production created like advertising industries and ways to try to offload their products onto various markets around the globe. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. And so part of that is we have to reimagine our relationship with various goods that we buy, trying to find ways to reuse, sure, of course, but also really try to find ways to organize within our own communities to address policy changes, to address regulations. It's not enough. We're far past the point where recycling or reusing or avoiding waste could have saved us. We have to find political solutions because this is a political problem, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I completely agree that we need like such a multifaceted level of response. And I think this kind of goes back to something, Dr. O'Brien, you were saying earlier about how reading some of the exile stories in the Hebrew Bible might help us better understand how we build new stories, right? So like if we're to build a world that is not reliant on capitalist structures and corporations, if we are to build a world that not only reuses and recycles, but also reduces our consumption and lives in harmony together. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how those exile stories or your work more broadly has intersected and maybe helps to reimagine some of those narratives that we hold.
Yeah, I was in preparing this, I was thinking a lot about, because a lot of the texts that I work on are likely produced after the exile, right? After Jerusalem is no longer a capital city, there's no longer a Davidic king. And as the Jewish tradition continues even beyond the Bible, it's fascinating how the ancient traditions are always reconfigured and made to mean something else, so that, for the majority of Jews today, not true for all Jews today, the temple's not a desire, right? That has been replaced by acts of loving kindness. Not all Jews are looking for a Davidic Messiah to come. So what happens is, and what's sad, that I'm thinking about what you just said, Bradley, is that it actually takes crisis to enter your own life and for you to see what it is, for people to begin to reimagine what their traditions can look like. And so I was so encouraged Bradley, when you were sharing the work of the Green Anglicans, that they're not just doing what some folks we could see as political stances, but they're changing their liturgies, right? And so this is, again, because I work in a seminary, I think must happen within religious communities. We have to change what songs we're singing. We have to change the words that tradition the next generation into that. I mean, it can't be an add-on. It has to change everything. And so I don't know if that answered your question, Katie, but I'm just really struck that, within Judaism, like there was the development of the synagogue after the temple was gone. There were new focus on practices like eating kosher, which, if you think about it, is a way of restricting your food intake according to your principles. So there are, even circumcision became more important. And then again, a principle behind that, which I'm looking at the principles, is I'm willing to carry the marks on my body of what is important to me and my identity. So I'm trying to reimagine, if that's the name of today's session, like reimagine, okay, what would those things look like? What would be their modern equivalents in the time of climate crisis? New songs, new worship, new ways of eating, new ways of how do we carry these realities in our body. And sadly, I do, maybe the positive note is that the more and more people experience the realities of the changing climate, the more the need for things to change is going to be evident.
I think that's a really important point that you raised, because one of the things we talk about often in climate and movement spaces is that injustices don't affect us all equally. And so people with more resources, it takes longer perhaps sometimes for them to wake up to some of these realities. So Dr. Johnson, one thing that kind of I think ties to this and something you were sharing is that many of these churches that responded to the water crisis in Cape Town were also communities that had done work around apartheid. And I'm wondering if you saw any overlap or connection between those two spaces in the ways that communities responded to one, or that in responding to one, if there's any places of connection or overlap that you saw in your work, and how a community that was committed to the one practice of justice ended up also being committed to exploring how the water crisis impacted folks.
Oh, definitely. I think one of the most obvious places is looking at who, both under apartheid and in the current climate crisis in South Africa and across the world, is who suffers most, which we've talked about a little bit. Those are the poorest. Those are the historically marginalized because of race. And in Cape Town, it's no different. 30% of Cape Town does not have piped water in their homes because the infrastructure has just not kept up with it. They have to go to standpipes outside of their homes to fill up, and then they have to go back to corrugated tin shacks or wherever they're forced to live. And these people also suffered during the water crisis in ways that people living on the mountain slopes and the other side of the city didn't really have to deal with, because even if they didn't have water flowing, they had to reduce the amount of water flowing through the homes. They could still buy buckets of water. Cost was not an option for them because they had a lot of money. But in terms of the communities who are fighting the climate crisis, they absolutely see that connection between who is suffering the most, and also, frankly, who's most to blame for the crises too, because I think Cape Town was a very interesting place for me to do this research, because it is kind of a mirror between the larger situation with the global north and the global south, where you have one side, the global north, causing most carbon emissions historically, consuming the most, producing the most, and then you have global south suffering most of the brunt of the impacts. And so I think a lot of the churches recognized that was the exact same dynamic playing out in this case, and it would keep playing out in terms of future crises that Cape Town, other parts of South Africa will encounter. And they saw it as a justice issue on the same level, because the kind of climate apartheid will not be legally enforced in the exact same way as South African apartheid was, but it still is real, I think.
Yeah, and that feels really important to emphasize and highlight, because I think we do a terrible job sometimes of even learning from our own work and leadership in previous spaces. So like thinking about the lessons both as far back as our like biblical texts. So like for Dr. O'Brien doing a lot of her work in the Hebrew Bible, through to like movements for social change throughout like more recent history, like the last 50 years. We win in an area, but then we don't do the follow-up work to ensure that the kind of the systemic ways that is built in, we don't actually explore how to undo those. And then we also so quickly forget how to implement those lessons again the next time that there is an injustice occurring in our communities. So I could chat about this all day, but we do have some folks who are asking some questions in the chat. And so one of these questions comes from Gretchen Deeg, who has a question specifically for Dr. O'Brien or another speaker, is regarding this idea that there's a growing political divide, and that people are valuing their politics over religious values. And so Gretchen was asking if you have any advice on how to practically walk people through this kind of return to a value-centric conversation instead of these political triggers and talking points.
Hi, Gretchen. I wish I could overcome political divides. If anybody could figure that out, please let me know. I think this my only thing that I would offer for conversation is that sometimes our advocacy has to be strategic. And sometimes, I don't know how this is going to sound, but sometimes it means not using all of our words. There are folks who've been able to do particular advocacy around racial justice, around economic justice, and climate justice, but not using those words, right? So I wonder what happens in your context, which you know far better than I, what happens if your context, if a specific environmentally related problem in your area could be taken on without necessarily highlighting the theoretical underpinnings of climate justice. And then to talk about values that you do think might be shared among different people of care for other people, right? Of care for the poor. I mean, I actually learned a lot by looking at the Evangelical Environmental Network. They use different language, or alliance, I've forgotten the name of it. They use different language than I do. And there's a way in which I want to bristle at it, but at the same time, I realize how their language would be far more persuasive to their community than I would. So I wonder what, and it's true for me too. When I hear certain terms, they're triggering, and I just assume that I know everything about you if you say this one thing. And so I wonder what happens, to go back to Leviticus, if we do the work and don't always talk about it, right? Like, so, in Cape Town, we have this problem of water. How will we deal with that? And then offer the discussions about climate change elsewhere in that way. But I don't know that that's helpful. But sometimes I do think that our world, our country especially, buzzwords are so off-putting. I hate to use the word triggering. They're so off-putting that how can we do work together without using all of our words?
Words are really powerful. And I think that the way we use them really matters. And I've often found in my own work that framing things as a question instead of a statement, inviting people's curiosity and interaction and engagement, often shifts it from political talking points very quickly to a more values-centered conversation. Whether or not people all share the same values, even if they hold the same faith, is not always true. But asking questions and inviting people to engage their curiosity beyond the talking points that they've heard in the news and in other places often shifts the dynamic of the conversation. Dr. Johnson, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So something I thought was really interesting in Cape Town is that among everyone I talked to, no one had any sense that climate change wasn't happening. As in, they all believed that climate change was a real thing, that it was happening, and that was a given, except for one person who was a politician and who I knew for a fact imbibed a lot of like Fox News and American GOP rhetoric. But aside from that, everyone was convinced it was a problem. And I think that kind of points to one of the uniquely American challenges of trying to mobilize congregations around this, is that climate change denial, even though Dr. O'Brien was very correct that a lot of Christians, even evangelicals, are warming up to the idea that climate change is real, that it is a problem that needs to be addressed, you still have the long damage that climate denial up to this point has caused. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because of the usual suspects of fossil fuel propaganda, various kinds of news outlets that are funded by them and wants to make sure that that we couldn't have our standard of living now without fossil fuels, and therefore we should never leave them ever. Um, but I think something that was really interesting that I read was Robin Globus Veldman's book, The Gospel of Climate Skepticism, which agrees with what Dr. O'Brien said, that like, no matter who you talk to, no matter what kinds of culture war keywords they might be against, like talking about climate change or what, they might be like climate change is a hoax and all these things, but they're still going to care about the quality of their local air and water. They're still going to care about whether or not there's trash all over the neighborhood. They're gonna care about like their actual local environments. And so sometimes if you can't get them to focus on organize against climate change on a broader scale, it's still not bad for them to advocate for like closing down certain fossil fuel infrastructure near them, or fighting for cleaner rivers and such like that. You do what you can.
And Bradley, I thought there were several things on one of your slides about what some of the things the Green Anglicans had done is they took people to those places.
Yeah.
You know, I think especially for folks that have been insulated from devastation, you know, to go on field trips. And you don't have to go far, like just to see what the land looks like around a fracking site, or, you know, to see, like, go visit a landfill, or, you know, to do those kinds of things so that the local, you know, the global becomes local. I thought that was really smart.
Yeah, I think one thing I am learning in the work that we do here at PIPL is the importance of making those global to local connections, like bypassing all the in-between noise that happens and allowing people to learn from each other across local contexts, but in places that are unfamiliar so that they can learn from each other. Like, so in this case, right, Green Anglicans work in Cape Town. How might that impact the group in Pittsburgh that's talking about fracking, right? And what lessons could be learned and shared across those spaces? And that seems like a place where there's a lot of potential. This kind of bleeds over into a question that Sheila was asking, also around this idea of the politicization of climate change. And she spoke about the recent declaration from the Pope, the additional one that just came out. And so I'll say that I haven't had a chance to fully read through it yet. I'm excited to read over it probably later today. But wondering if either of you have had a chance to read it or have anything else you want to add to kind of this. How can we leverage the voices of folks like Pope Francis, or maybe Desmond Tutu's work around apartheid in Africa, or others in helping to move forward or to shift the conversation from that political realm to that value-centric conversation?
I'm sorry. Go, please, Bradley.
No, I was just saying quickly that I haven't read yet. I know it just came out. I'm excited to read it because Laudato Si was great. Again, everyone should read it, even if you're not Catholic. It's great it's because he goes for it. But I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I'm trying to remember what the second part of your question was.
So how might resources like that help shift us from that political space to that values space?
Yes. In the case of Desmond Tutu, not only was he in the anti-apartheid movement, but he also became really big into fossil fuel divestment towards the end of his life. That's probably a lesser known part of his life. But I think part of this is really just as simple and complicated as organizing with people in your congregations, with groups like Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, with other groups who are committed to fighting the climate crisis on the level of policy, level of politics. I mean, I hate to say it, but climate change is inherently a political issue because it's not just a lack of information. This is something that some scientists need to learn too. It's not just a lack of information about climate change sometimes. It's because certain interests and groups of people benefit and profit from climate change. There are trillions of dollars, of assets invested in fossil fuel infrastructure that they're not going to give up just because the oceans are rising a little bit or the earth is getting hotter. That's a lot of money for them. And if they think they can survive that, they're going to keep doing that. And so I think you need to find ways to get plugged in with people power to fight for regulations on them and to find ways to disinvest and shut down fossil fuel production, move into more renewable space.
Yes. Just really quickly, there was a book that I read, I don't know how long ago. It was actually, I read it in my work around LGBT issues. It's by a sociologist named Dawn Moon called God, Sex, and Politics. And what she did is she just watched how people in congregations talk and think. And that's where she helped me realize that we liberals, progressives, we're really arrogant because we treat anybody who disagrees with us as uneducated. And we think that education will change people's minds. And we're not really respecting their honest difference of values. And I would agree with you, Bradley. I don't accept a distinction between values and politics. I mean, one's an extension of the other. So I do think that the other thing that I learned from Moon is people change their minds much more frequently if they're able to recognize in somebody else's experience something common to their own. So I don't know how we can begin to help quit arguing and help people develop empathy with folks who are being harmed. And then I think it has to start with some of the empathy and then ask, what are the structural dimensions of this that we can address? But often people are far more moved by an empathetic response to somebody else because selfishly, the way they've just described their oppression, their experience, I can feel that myself. That's like my own, So it takes really thoughtful pastoral as well as smart leaders to help think about what you already know about how people come to change, because that's the hope. That's what I bring as a Christian hope. People can change.
Well, I'm always shocked by how quickly we run out of time. We had a really insightful question from Gamal that we're not going to really have a chance to dive into, but I will share just that he noted that Bell's Hooks identifies institutional, interpersonal, and personal frameworks as the places where oppression exists, but also potentially places where we can ignite change. And so I have a couple of quick things that I'm going to share with folk, but I'm going to throw this question to our speakers to think about for a second and then leave us with the final word. Is in the context of those three spaces, what do you think a reimagined Christian response to climate crisis looks like? So while our speakers think on that, I'm just going to invite you that if you've enjoyed today's conversation, next month we will gather again on Wednesday, November 1st at noon. We will be taking a dive into the reconstructed Jewish tradition, and we will be discussing a Jewish approach to activism and accompaniment through the climate crisis. So the link to register for that will be in the follow-up email. And then also you've seen some information in the chat about our annual conference coming up and a screening that we have on oil and climate crisis, so many of the themes that have come up today. And if you did enjoy today's program, we would love for you to consider making a small donation so that we can consider and keep doing this work. And if you can't donate, consider telling a friend or posting up on social media, letting people know that you enjoyed our conversation. As we've talked about today, there are a lot of ways to build social movement and work that don't involve money and the kind of structures that we all operate in as our norm. All right, I am going to, with that, turn it back over to Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Johnson for a final short word.
I think the last thought I would leave is that something I've kind of been saying all along in a way is that we need to that we've both been saying all along, is that we need to reimagine our faith in response to this crisis and what this crisis actually demands from us. The Christian faith, various traditions that encompass it, have been around for almost 2,000 years, and there have been a lot of disasters, apocalypses along the way that have shaped how communities of faith have tried to survive and at times try to change the world for the better. And I think we need to learn from that, learn from the traditions we have, and organize to use the power that we have to fight this.
That was beautiful. And I would agree with that. And I guess of all those different layers, I think sometimes what's happened in some Christian traditions is really done climate, environmental work at the individual level, like recycle. How do you change your consumption patterns? And those are all really important things to consider. And then we've gone to the global and said, how do we change all of those things? So how do we find that intersectional space where one of the things I take away from this conversation today is how can we draw on some of the things that we already know, some of the wisdom that we already have about how people are moved to change, how does change happen, how do people adapt to change, and maybe we need to learn how to celebrate the ways that communities have adapted instead of assuming that the past was great and we could return to it. But let's look at how somebody said this in the chat, how our communities have changed and maybe changed for the better in response to crisis. So again, how do we draw on all the wisdom that's available to us, no matter where it is?
And again, it is that I end up leaving a conversation with more questions than I had when it started. And so maybe that ties us back to the very beginning of what I shared from Bell Hooks, is that love keeps us curious. And so I want to thank you all for being here in this space with us today, for exploring this topic and engaging so delightfully. I look forward to and hope to see you at one of our other upcoming events, and we will offer ways for you to connect with both of these speakers if you have follow-up questions in the email that will come out after this recording is done. If you registered, you should get all of that information. So I hope you enjoy the long weekend, and offering to remember on whose land it is that we sojourn. Thank you all.